Hello, everyone. Welcome to this session. I am Rick Weiss, Director of SciLine. SciLine is a philanthropically supported free service based at the American Association for the Advancement of Science in Washington, D.C., which connects U.S. journalists to scientists to help get more research-backed evidence into news stories. I want to welcome you all to this late-breaking session in which we're going to talk a lot about the pace of science, and in particular, the speed at which science typically progresses and the speed at which the new coronavirus is spreading around the globe, and how the scientific community is coping with and responding to the difference between those two speeds. So science, as we all know, typically advances incrementally and methodically, deliberatively. And so it's very gratifying that so far science has moved actually very quickly in response to COVID. But we all know that that speed can be dangerous. We know that the plethora of preprints that have been showing up in response to COVID are sometimes not as accurate as fully peer-reviewed journal articles. We know that the public is sometimes passing very rapidly wrong information, either by mistake or unintentionally. And we know that we're in a situation where the media, which is has such a big responsibility for communicating what is happening with this pandemic to the public, is also in suffering a plague of its own, where newsrooms have shrunk incredibly over the last 10 years. In the United States alone, newsrooms have lost more than half of their personnel just in the last decade or so. So we have a situation where there's a great hunger for information, and yet there's a lot of wrong information out there. And how do we sort through that? And it's not only, of course, scientists and the public who need this information, but it's also the funders and the other institutions that help make the scientific community work. So we're here to discuss today what is COVID revealing about the resilience of these scientific research and communication and funding systems themselves, and what can we learn from this stressful experience? What kind of lessons can we take home to improve how the scientific ecosystem actually works? And to do that, we have four people with deep expertise in four different areas that we want to focus on today. I'm not going to give you their full bios right now because those are available online, but the order of events today is that we will first hear remarks from Sudip Parikh, who is the Chief Executive Officer at the American Association for the Advancement of Science in Washington and the Executive Publisher of the Science family of journals. We'll next hear from Katja Becker, who is the president of Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft DFG German Research Foundation, which pumps more than 3 billion euros into the research ecosystem each year. Dominique Brossard, professor and chair of the Department of Life Sciences Communication at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And then Helen Branswell, who's a senior writer for infectious diseases and global health for STAT, the highly respected health news site run collaboratively with the Boston Globe newspaper. Each will make a brief presentation, after which I'm going to moderate some discussion among the panelists, and then we'll start taking questions from the audience. So we encourage you to submit those by hovering over the chat mode at the bottom of your screen and submitting your question that way. And with that introduction in place, I'd like to now turn it over to Sudip to get us started.
Thank you, Rick, and thank you to the organizers for including me in this session. It is late breaking, I think, is exactly the right term because we're going to be talking about the pace of the science and the flow of communication. At the American Association for the Advancement of Science, we are the publisher for Science Magazine and for the science journals. We're also the society that works to try and build trust between scientists and decision makers, scientists and policymakers, but also scientists and journalists and scientists and members of the faith community. And so this has been a really testing and trying time for the organization. And frankly, I'm just so proud of how we're able to try and meet this moment. Look, as a publisher of journals that are highly cited, we have a responsibility to the scientific community, and in this case, to the public, to ensure that we are holding up the highest standards of scientific rigor and reliability. And the times are amazing. The time from isolation of the coronavirus that causes COVID-19 to the atomic resolution structure of the coat protein was 2 or 3 months. Just extraordinary timescales when you put it into perspective, into the perspective of the past, and look at HIV or look at other viruses and other infectious diseases. Incredible amounts of progress in that time period. And at Science Magazine and the science journals, our goal is not to be a bottleneck in getting information out to policymakers and to the public, while still maintaining that scientific rigor. And one of the questions that was asked of me is, have the changes that are posed by this time speed up created any risks? They certainly have. They certainly have. I think it would be irresponsible to say they haven't. We are working at timescales that frankly, the peer review system is unaccustomed to. That said, we have introduced resources, and then we have a committed group of professional editors that are working to curate, to open the aperture of what is the science that is important in this moment to get across. And what that's led to is having a standing team of reviewers that are ready, knowing what type of science is going to mature at these different points in time, and having them ready and willing to do peer review quickly. It's meant that in some cases, peer review has taken, instead of being weeks or months, has taken days, less than a week, and yet still maintaining the quality. And I'm proud to say that we have done that in most cases. We've published scores of papers related to COVID now. If you ask me, have any of them been retracted? Have any of them been corrected? I'll knock on wood somewhere and say that no, they haven't. But that is a risk. It is a risk. We are moving quickly. But at this point in time, we're looking at the risk benefit of moving quickly versus not having peer review take place and not having information get into the hands of policymakers or into the hands of the public. What I think has been really important, in addition to that, has been science's contribution to news and analysis. We do look at papers. We do that curation of the research. We also have a news team, and Rick was mentioning the mega trends related to journalism. We're fortunate at Science that our news team has been growing because we view it as a very valuable contribution to the scientific ecosystem. We do not make money at it. We're the American Association for the Advancement of Science. We lose money with doing news, but it's an important part of what we do. And there we've moved from a magazine which had weekly content to our reporters and our analysts really working 24 hours a day. And if you ask them, they will say they're tired. They will say that they are that this has been a challenge for them over the last 7 months. But what you'll also see is commitment and passion to this being the moment that they've built their careers for. And that they feel this sense of obligation and responsibility to doing the work that really a handful of journalists are capable of doing. And at Science, we're looking at presenting news that is aimed at scientists and the scientific enterprise, but then gets picked up, frankly, by much broader media, and serving as a basis for that communication. And so we see it at AAAS as part of our responsibility to try and have that communication be clear and accurate and understandable. So at Science, they're working on getting these papers out for the scientific community and making sure they're right and not live up to the scientific rigor that's necessary. At AAAS, we're also working on the communication to say, this is what this means. This is what this means, and we have a variety of services that work with journalists to try and provide context, provide clarity for the information that's coming. It's not perfect, but it is something that I think we will continue to work at and continue to play a key role in. As a society made up of members who are scientists, beyond our work in the journals and in the news, we also have an obligation to try and help scientists learn how to communicate and do it in a way that is local. And we have several programs that introduce journalists to scientists. hoping to actually make it more local. So not necessarily always going to experts at the NIH or on the East or West Coast of the United States, but looking for experts who might be local to the venues that where they work, hoping to make communication from a more trustworthy source be possible. And we're working very hard at that as well. These are extraordinary times. I think everyone who is living through this has had to face both adversity, but then also faced this moment of opportunity of saying, how can we take what we've done over the past 20 years, and how can we aim that in this moment to both be helpful to society and also have some things outlive this moment. Some things that hopefully we can incorporate into what we're doing to make science even more profoundly useful for society. And I look forward to this discussion, Rick, and to the rest of the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Sudip. And I love the opening sentiment that maybe we'll all, learn some new practices out of this terrible situation that really pay off into the future. You're also way ahead of the curve having a news operation that loses money because you're one of the few that doesn't seem to mind that you're losing money telling the news. So that's great that there's that out there. Katja Becker, let's hear a perspective from someone who's paying to have a lot of this science done.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rick. It's such a great pleasure to be with all of you in this virtual room here today. And I'm truly thankful for the opportunity to speak here and to exchange opinions and perspectives with all of you, those whom I can see and those out there whom we cannot see, unfortunately. So as you know, the DFG, the German Research Foundation, has responded to the coronavirus outbreak on several levels and in several ways. I just want to give a short overview of what has been done so far. So one of our first goals was, of course, to maintain our funding activities while protecting our staff, reviewers, and the researchers. Therefore, the DFG has introduced extensive special arrangements to ensure our ability to act and at the same time guarantee the stability and high quality of our review and evaluation procedures. Written opinions and video conferences have been used by all of us instead of physical meetings as far as possible. And where such adaptations were not possible, bridging financing is used, but also the extension of grant periods, the extension of calls for proposals, the extension of scholarships and employment contracts, particularly for doctoral students, as well as extensions of deadlines for final reports and the transferability of grants. In addition, together with the Federal Ministry of Research, 2 research vessels were sent out at short notice to ensure the continuation of the costly Mosaic expedition in the Arctic Ocean. You might have heard of that one. If not, have a look. It really is worth it. In total, the DFG decided on a whole package of measures and provided funding of 175 million euros for this purpose. And I can say that more than 2,500 applications to stabilize the research system, the science system, have already reached us. Our guiding principles in all of these actions were to keep students, particularly and young researchers, confident in the system and to protect research projects from a counterproductive termination. All this serves the purpose of keeping the negative effects of the pandemic for science as low as possible. However, we also took forward-looking approaches to optimizing the power of research in the light of the specific societal challenge we face today, which brings me to the second part. In order to realize these approaches, we think that we need interdisciplinary research and an international exchange of research data, methods, and findings. This is why the DFG launched a strategic call for multidisciplinary research into epidemics and pandemics in response to the SARS-CoV-2 outbreak. In addition to investigating the current pandemic, our goal is to identify fundamental research questions that produce also generalizable scientific findings. This includes, for example, the investigation of the effects on healthcare system, psychological, social, and cultural factors, legal and ethical implications. It includes the impacts on global and regional economic development, production and value creation chains, logistics, transport and communication, and of course, fundamental biological and medical aspects of the pandemic. And I can say that so far more than 400 proposals from all disciplines have reached us here. Furthermore, the DFG has established, as you might have heard of, an interdisciplinary commission for pandemic research. The commission is made up of 18 members representing, as far as possible, all research disciplines. This commission is to support and connect DFG-funded projects investigating pandemics, including both existing work and novel projects, including, of course, all the internationally related projects. This commission will also have the task of monitoring the overall basic research landscape in relation to pandemics and identifying potential research needs, giving special attention to inter- and transdisciplinary cooperation and strengthening synergies. In addition, the Commission is to orchestrate a new funding instrument, which is called COVID-19 Focus Funding. This is designed to enable scientists to address especially urgent research questions requiring very, very rapid answers. So the Commission will issue calls on these different urgent topics identified. And the first call for this fast-track program was launched on August 10th and concerns the topic immunity, host susceptibility, and pathomechanisms of SARS-CoV-2 infection, because we believe that this will enhance the basic knowledge on immunological processes, which is essential for the optimization of vaccines and drugs. In general, the Commission is to operate on a purely science and quality-driven basis with a long-term focus and represent relevant activities of the DFG both within and outside the research community. In particular, this includes close cooperation with national and international institutions and partner organizations. For instance, the Commission could initiate those types of research projects that could maybe contribute to research needs identified by the UN research roadmap for the COVID-19 recovery. So finally, the third part of this opening remark concerns internationalization, cooperation, communication. The measures taken by the DFG, as described, quite nicely show the division of tasks at the European level. The DFG, as a funding organization, like many of its partners in Europe, took these actions independently before Germany's 6-month EU presidency started in June. This EU presidency has to cope with the effects of the coronavirus crisis at the political level because the EU member states, the European Commission, and the European Parliament. First, and importantly, the management of the final negotiations of the EU budget is important, including the use of the Next Generation Recovery Fund. And second, the implementation of measures labeled Europe's resilience to crisis, including the COVID-19 in particular, but also in general. And of course, there might also be other crises in the future. In addition, the EU set up an ERA versus Corona action plan at the member state level. So, yet intensified responses to tackle the pandemic can also amplify, unfortunately, the competition between nations and societies. This is clear to see in the struggle to secure future vaccine doses and drugs. In recent months, new forms of nationalism have unfortunately arisen. Therefore, it becomes all the more important to set research funding conditions in which it is possible to prioritize cooperation over competition. That's why in recent months, the DFG has emphatically called for cooperation between the best researchers worldwide, including through the Global Research Council. The DFG has also initiated a number of bilateral calls, for example, with our Chinese partner organization, and through these we again encourage researchers to share their results. Competition is intensified these days not only by political leaders and parties, but also by a general pressure. Sudip already mentioned this, by a general pressure that in research expects the fastest possible results, and in the media could lead to statements that can be easily instrumentalized. This adds to a more general problem, the question of how to safeguard not only the quality of rapid research, but also the quality of science communication. In fact, one main challenge in dealing with the coronavirus pandemic is precisely the question how to maneuver academia within the global infrastructures of information and communication, where, as United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres called it, a dangerous epidemic of misinformation is well underway. So one of the crucial questions here is, how can we guarantee that researchers can also communicate with the public in a fact-based way? Thank you very much for these 10 minutes.
Thank you, Katja. That was perfect and a wonderful segue to talk a little bit more about the communication issues. I'll just say, in looking back on your first remarks so far, it's very inspiring to me to see that organizations like the DFG are thinking not only about how to deal with COVID, but how to keep the rest of the scientific enterprise alive and well while we all turn our attention to this. We've seen a similar thing in journalism where every reporter in the world now is practically a health reporter for a while now, but we don't want other parts of journalism to wither in the meanwhile. So I love that your focus remains there. And I love also the idea that as a funder, you have some leverage to counter the nationalistic and competitive instincts that are sometimes coming out, and you can use your power that way of being a funder to help maybe people's better selves come to the fore. Anyway, let's move on to Dominique to talk a little bit more about the communication angle here.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be with such a distinguished panel. Although obviously I would love to be with our audience in Trieste, Italy, and hopefully that will be in the near future. We can resume our exchanges and see each other's in face to face. I think Sudip and Katja actually have touched upon some aspects that are important to keep in mind when we think about communication. First of all, communication is something that is a science. There's the science of science communication. It's a social science discipline that actually relies on academic research that should be as rigorous, if not more, I would say, than the research in life science and biological sciences. Why do I say that? It's because very often people take for granted the idea that they can communicate. And all of us, to some extent, think that we are expert in communication, but we will never be claimed to be expert in a medical field and so on. So I love when Katja pointed out the necessity for interdisciplinary research as we tackle the extremely wicked problems of this world, including the pandemic. And I think that includes social sciences and biomedical sciences, life science, and so on, data sciences, computer science, and so on. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. But I'd like to step back because I know that a lot of people in the audience are like, oh, social sciences as important as other type of science. Well, believe me, as a matter of fact, as a former geneticist, I felt when I went back and did a PhD in social science that actually Understanding human behavior is way more complicated to some extent than understanding other type of life-related issues, because we control a certain amount of variance when we build models to understand human behavior. See, if we have 60%, of variance on why people feel differently about an issue explained by our statistical model, we're very happy. Well, tell that to a physicist and they will disagree with you. So this being said, risk communication as a social science enterprise is actually relatively new. It started in the 80s when we realized that nuclear power and nuclear energy were actually really not accepted by the general public, although from a technical point of view, it made sense as a source of energy. And people therefore began trying to understand in risk communication for a social science perspective and came up with like a basic rules. I'm just going to say them so like we have them in the background here. Number one, good risk communication relies on the right definition of risk. Which risk are we measuring? Number two, understanding the audiences and how they react to that specific risk, and link to really both way dialogues with all the stakeholders that are involved in the issue. Number three, developing messages that are not only credible and trustworthy, but are actually consistent among all the actors that are communicating. And that means the foundation, Kaja, that means Sudip Science, that means Sciline and the journalists. And obviously Helen can really talk about this as one of the main actors in these things. And number four, and I would say this is the most important right here, is that we've learned from actually 2 decades of research close that acknowledged uncertainty is one of the key factors that's important in risk communication. In a nutshell, there's on one hand the objective assessment of a certain risk based on the probability of people getting sick, for example. On the other hand, there's the subjective assessment of the risk, which is how people feel about it. And when you think about risk communication, it's really not to communicate the probability of infection. It's not about, like communicating the number of deaths and so on. It's really trying to understand what's the subjective assessment of that audience you're trying to reach and what is the risk they care about. As a consensus report from the National Academy of Science pointed out, when they released a report looking at risk assessment and their fallacies, the result was we can really well answer with technical data the wrong question. And why am I saying that? Because right now, maybe people in certain community, they're actually not concerned about the spread of the disease, but they're concerned about mental health. They're concerned about their kids at school achievement. They're concerned about job security. They're concerned about a vast array of risk factors that are not purely the biomedical one. And I think one of the challenges here, as we all think about this, is that we think in terms of risk and risk communication in a very narrow sense. And we actually keep on thinking mainly in terms of biomedical related issues, when certainly the social dimensions right now are obviously as important to think in terms of what should we do and not do. So I was asked to also say some of the challenges. I think I pointed out some of them, and one that is very important for us to think about is, although we do have some guidelines as far as risk communication in general, it's mainly applied to what we call normal science. However, my colleagues in sociology of science would say the wicked issue that the pandemic denotes is a really good case of what we call post-normal science. The stakes are high, the facts are in dispute, there's a lot of unknown, and the science advanced way faster than the ability for the public to grasp what's right and wrong. So which leads to the second challenge we have here. There's been claims of misinformation being extremely important right now, and I wouldn't say that is not true. There's been claimed by the WHO that we have infodemics, which is also potentially true, and Kaiser actually talked about that. However, from an empirical point of view, we do not know the effect of this misinformation in people's behaviors and attitudes. We do not know if that prevents them from wearing masks or not, or social distance or not. So we urge all of us to be extremely careful, by taking an easy way out and claiming that misinformation and facts that are not understood are the problem that we need to tackle. I would say this is an empirical question. It's too early to say. And I would say also that we don't know for sure the extent to that infodemics in the sense of how it impacts people. Because correcting science seems actually easy when we think that there are right facts and wrong facts. But as Kaja and Sudip said, the science is advancing so fast that the facts of today are going to be actually wrong tomorrow, potentially. So if you put yourself in the context of a public audience, you would see how that can be challenging when on top of that, we know, and that's going to be my last point today, that people process information after filtering it by different type of mechanism, something that we call mental shortcuts or perceptual filters, and a number of issues or a number of psychological processes that I'm not going to detail today. But what does it mean? As my colleague Dietschem Schäufele put it really well in a recent talk with the National Academy of Science, each fact is what we want each of us, them to be. That means that the fact for Kaisa or the fact for Sudip or Rick hopefully will be also factual for me, but for something else, somebody else, depending on who conveys the information, it may be dismissed or accepted. So I want to say that this is one of the challenges we face right now, is that whole issue of fact checking and misinformation that needs to be actually tackled very carefully and understanding how it's going to be processed by the public. Why? Because we know that actually it's not a problem of science communication per se. It's a problem of science, politics, of a number of other issues being intertwined in that issue. It's a problem of audience become polarized around different issues that come to play at the same time as the pandemic evolved. We have an election coming up in the United States. We have an issue that became heavily politicized when I was giving talks in March saying, let's hope this doesn't get politicized or we're going to be like climate change, fighting about if it's right or wrong to wear a mask. So we have to face the fact that we are, facing challenges that go beyond just correcting factual information and that go beyond, just doing the right science communication. And to go back to what Kaja said, and I think Sudi was mentioning that as well, I think it's only all together putting our heads around the problems that we face that we will be able to bring solutions. It's interdisciplinarity that will actually help move on. And to end up on a positive note, I think what happened in Wisconsin is very, very positive, although now it became politicized in Wisconsin. But when the pandemic started, a group of university researchers actually started a group that include the Wisconsin League of Municipalities, the Department of Public Health, the local representative of the CDC, data scientists, and so on, that tackle this issue at the local level from a common front perspective, take into account all the disciplines to make sure we have a common front and be able to be productive in tackling this issue. Thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Dominique. That's so interesting. And in science, it's been such a cliche for so many years about the importance of interdisciplinary cooperation, but I think never has it been so clear as in a pandemic where human behavior is so much a part of the issue here, and the whole social science domain. If ever it's going to get integrated with the geneticists and everybody else, the immunologists, now is the time to see that happen. It's perhaps that will be one of the silver linings. Helen, you're living in the world of journalism and trying to communicate some of the things that we've just been hearing with the general public, desperate to know what's going on and what they should do. What are you seeing?
Okay, so hi, folks. Thank you very much for inviting me to be on this panel. As Rick said at the beginning, I am a journalist with STAT, which is a Boston-based news organization. I cover infectious diseases. That's my beat. And I was asked to sort of describe what it's been like covering this outbreak and sort of put it in context of some of the other outbreaks that I've covered. So to do that, I sort of have to start by taking you back to New Year's Eve 2019, which doesn't it seem like 15 lifetimes ago? I'd taken some time off last Christmas and I was spending it with family in Ottawa, Canada. And on the afternoon of New Year's Eve, I was checking my email and saw something from ProMed that really gave me pause. If you don't know ProMed, it's the program for monitoring emerging diseases run by the International Society for Infectious Diseases. The subject line on that ProMed email was undiagnosed pneumonia, China, Hubei, request for information. The post contained a couple of machine translated articles about 4 people in Wuhan, China, who had been diagnosed with the pneumonia, but they couldn't figure out what the cause of the pneumonia was. It stopped me in my tracks because it reminded me very vividly of ProMed posts from 16 years earlier in February 2003, which contained queries and warnings about atypical pneumonias cropping up in Guangdong, China. That 2003 event turned out to be the outbreak that we know of as SARS, and which we now call SARS-1. In 2003, I was a health reporter for the Canadian Press in Toronto. And as you all will know, Toronto had one of the biggest outbreaks of SARS in the world, and certainly the biggest outside of Asia. I'd never covered an outbreak caused by an emerging disease before. In fact, I was relatively new to health and science coverage at the time. I found it fascinating and exhausting, and it changed the trajectory of my career. For years now, I've reported pretty much exclusively on infectious diseases and global health. So back to New Year's Eve 2019. When I saw that report out of Hubei province, I knew it could be trouble. I wasn't certain how much trouble it was going to be, but I knew it was something I had to watch very closely. And that afternoon I tweeted, hopefully this is nothing out of the ordinary, but a ProMed posting about unexplained pneumonias in China is giving me SARS flashbacks. That tweet kind of has made me a little bit famous in small circles. I went back to work on January the 2nd, and when the case count jumped to 44, I wrote my first story about the outbreak on January 4th. I've written roughly 100 articles since then, and I think only 4 or 5 of them weren't about COVID-19. And most of the rest of them were about the fact that the US has withdrawn from the World Health Organization because of the handling of COVID-19. Like its predecessor, SARS-2 has been exhausting and fascinating. I found SARS-1 exhilarating. I don't feel the same way about this outbreak. I really love a little boredom right now, but I don't see that on the horizon. I had written in the interval for years about the damage pandemics could do, especially during the time when H5N1 bird flu seemed to be looming as a possible pandemic threat. And of course, in 2009, there was actually a pandemic, the mild H1N1 flu pandemic. So that experience prepared me for some of the things that have come up in this outbreak, but definitely not for others. I knew there would be shortages of personal protective equipment for health workers, but I didn't expect them to materialize so quickly. I expected food shortages and supply chain problems, but I didn't anticipate that everyone would become bakers and that all of a sudden you couldn't buy flour or yeast. I knew that vaccine nationalism would be a problem, and it is indeed. I knew we'd watch science evolve in real time, but I wasn't prepared for the blessing and curse of preprints. On the issue of the science evolving in real time, I think I would have hoped that we would have gotten better as a society between 2003 and now at explaining to the population how science does evolve in an outbreak like this. It was something I noticed really early on in SARS-1. People would report things and we'd think we would have learned X or Y about the disease or transmission or the highest risks. And then as time would evolve, it became clearer that actually, that wasn't true. And we needed to reset our thinking about X or Y. And I remember at the time people being annoyed or the public being angry because they felt they'd been misled. I guess I thought we should have gotten better at preparing the public to anticipate that kind of change in an outbreak, but we really, really have not. It's been very evident in things like the policies on the wearing of cloth masks in public, whether the public should wear them. At the beginning of this outbreak, there was zero data. There were zero data to say whether or not a cloth mask, which could be a bandana or something, much more sophisticated than that, would actually help to cut down on transmission of the virus. That data has emerged, but before it did, well, that data is emerging, but before it did, organizations like the Centers for Disease Control and the World Health Organization did not advocate that people wear masks. When it became clear that it was helpful and they changed their positions, the public became very angry and felt that they'd really been misled and that people had dropped the ball. But this was actually science-based organizations trying to issue science-based policies. We don't do a good job of explaining that to people, of explaining to them that this is something that's brand new and our understanding of it will evolve and we need to evolve with it. And I hope we'll get better at it, but I'm not sure we will. And had I heard Dominique's talk before this pandemic, I would have maybe thought I was being naive to think that we could get better at that so quickly. So some other things that I would remark upon here. I knew that pandemics would be hugely challenging for some countries, many countries. I would never have predicted that the United States would mount one of the worst responses in the world. That has been fascinating and kind of horrifying. I would also say that I never anticipated that the actual existence of a pandemic would be disputed for political reasons and that segments of the population would dismiss as a hoax a virus that has already killed more than 850,000 people around the world and will kill many more before we learn to coexist with it. Covering this pandemic has been easier in some ways than SARS or the H1N1 flu pandemic, but much harder in other ways. We have terrific electronic tools now, like Zoom, that make it easy to connect. And of course, the world knows so much more about coronaviruses than it did in 2003 because of SARS-1 and the outbreak of MERS, the coronavirus that passes from camels to people in the Middle East and causes occasional outbreaks. But covering an event like this in such a highly politicized time in the United States has led to circumstances I could never have anticipated. During SARS-1 and H1N1, the US Centers for Disease Control held nearly daily briefings for reporters. In this outbreak, the CDC has been sidelined and largely silenced, and its credibility as a source of science-based guidance has been challenged. On multiple occasions, political staff of the Trump administration have rewritten CDC guidance, most recently to shift the stress of CDC's testing recommendations to focus on diagnosing sick COVID cases, not finding people who had been infected and were infectious so that they could be told to isolate themselves. The policy now stresses diagnosis, not surveillance. That will keep the case count down and allow the virus to spread. I knew from the 2009 flu pandemic that getting through to experts in the early days of a major disease event would be extraordinarily difficult, even if you had all of their telephone numbers. That was true then. It was true, on steroids at the beginning of this outbreak, although it has become a bit easier in recent months. I knew pandemics would be very busy, but this one is exponentially more overwhelming than H1N1 was. Feels like that almost every day we're hit with a tsunami of new preprints and studies and outbreak news. It has been extraordinarily difficult to keep up, which is a very uncomfortable position for a journalist to be in. As I mentioned earlier, preprints have been a blessing and a curse. The early sharing of science, of course, is to be applauded. Christian Drosten of Germany's pivotal study explaining how long people with mild or moderate COVID shed infectious disease came out in a preprint several weeks before it was published, and that was hugely useful. But there have been some terrible preprints that have never made it to publication and should never have made it into the public discourse, I think, including several that suggested the virus was man-made. When those types of papers burst into the headlines at STAT, we try to be judicious about whether or not we're going to give oxygen to a story that does not deserve it. For instance, pangolins may turn out to be an intermediary host that brought SARS-2 virus to humans. But so far, we haven't been persuaded that we need to write about them. Likewise, we've not written about the specious claims that the virus was engineered. But sometimes we do see moments when we think that jumping in early to put some emerging information into context would be really useful to our readers. Recently, for instance, researchers in Hong Kong, Belgium, and the Netherlands reported on people who have already contracted a second case of COVID-19 within months of their first. There has been a lot of hand-wringing about how long immunity to COVID infection will last, but reinfections have been expected, and it remains to be seen how long immunity will last in most cases. These cases could be outliers. So when stories like this start to emerge, we wrote a piece to explain that the sky is not falling. It's important to do that in some cases, but we have to pick and choose those moments, because if you spend too much time debunking bad science or bad stories, you don't devote time to the issues that really need to be reported. So I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to the Q&A.
A great overview of some tough calls that journalists and editors face every day. Very consequential decisions that have to be made on a very, short-term, fast basis. So quite a challenging space. Thank you, Helen. Great. So we're going to take a few minutes here just to open up a few of the things that we've heard so far, and then I want to start inviting questions from the audience. If you are in the audience and have some questions right now, please feel free to start entering them through your chat mode, and we'll start getting a queue of questions set up. But while that happens, I want to loop back around to our earlier speakers just for to expand on a few ideas. And Sudip, I'm going to start with you. It's so interesting that in the publishing realm, you have found that at least by putting enough resources into the equation, you are able to do more reviews and faster reviews than has typically been the case. And I'm wondering, in light of this overarching idea that we're playing with today, that perhaps COVID can teach us some things about being better in the future in all of the things that we're doing. Is this something that you can just keep doing forever? I mean, why? Maybe it's time for a new era when peer review gets done in 5 days instead of 3 months or 6 months. I mean, why not? Or would you go broke keeping this system going?
Yeah, it's funny. It's not about going broke. It's really about this not being a scalable thing. Artificial intelligence, although I've heard some people suggest that artificial intelligence would be a start to peer review, can't help us here. It requires editors who have been in this field for quite some time, and that is not a scalable thing. And so, yes, we're able to handle reviews so quickly right now, but it is not sustainable. There are people behind this, right? There are people, really national and global treasures, who are behind this at places like Science and elsewhere, that are taking an incredible number of papers. And for some perspective, we've received over 2,300 COVID-19 papers since January. That's Science alone. Science is, Science in our family of journals. That's 6 journals. We've received over 2,300 papers. We've published 89. Wow. So it's less than 4%. Less than 4%. And so when that happens, there are a very small number of people that I can count on one hand that are the intake for this, and they are the ones with the wisdom and frankly the experience to be able to look at this and curate and say, yes, you know what, if this is true, this is important enough to publish in Science, or if this is true, it's wonderful, but it's not necessarily impactful enough for science, or if this is true and unfortunate, or if this is not true, it's impactful enough for science. And we have there's such a small number of people doing that. So no, Rick, it's not sustainable, even with money. To be honest, it's not sustainable. And there are parts of what we've done, standing review and that sort of thing, that could be a lesson learned and help us go faster. But it's not sustainable. There is a human element to this that can't be scaled by technology yet. I wish there were.
Anyone else, before I move on to another topic, I wonder if others have thoughts about how publication has been working. Journalists are dependent on journals, but have been turning increasingly to preprints. Dominique, I'm sure you've heard, complaints about if you're going to communicate about science, but you're not sure who to trust. Is it better just to shut up? What about? What do some of you who are in the communication realm think about the limits of what's going on now? Yeah, Dominique.
Yeah, so actually, like the interesting thing that we haven't talked about right now is that we have assumed that science communication is a linear process, arguably, like theoretically, where, you would have like the science that produced in the lab, let's say, that's published after peer review, that then like a trusted journalist or not trusted, hopefully a trusted one, reports on and so on. But we haven't talked about the new tendency, I would say, of scientists to actually communicate directly with the public. And I think it's part of the preprint problem. I mean, people that are very like vocal on Twitter that will actually post the results of their study, and even if it hasn't been gone through peer review yet. And I think it is a problem. And some research we've done on the nanotechnology related field said that potentially this is good when there are results potentially, I don't know, that have a lot of ethical public implications, but actually technically it's not good because we do want to have the vetting of the scientific community, right? But I think in part of in the context of the pandemic, we've seen a lot of traffic on social media from the scientists themselves that get frustrated because you have to wait for the peer review because there's a lot of publications on, and therefore they post their preprint. I myself got in an argument with one of my colleagues at one of my papers that was posted somewhere on preprint, and I'm like, no, let's not do that. You didn't go through peer review. So I think we need to also talk about the responsibility of the scientists to, and it goes back to a point I think Kadia said, the necessity to train the scientists to actually the potential consequences of what they do. That, they may think that like they're helping society, but they're not. And I think Kaiser wanted to add something.
I'm going to ask Helen in a minute about how you deal with, scientists coming to you through Twitter or other means with information and how you decide whether to cover it. But Katja, go ahead, respond to that first.
Yeah. Thanks. Just very spontaneously, there's another aspect which, it has been touched very briefly before. In the world of social media, you just addressed, serious researchers find themselves quickly in positions where it is really impossible to explain methods or exchange arguments and perspectives. And so heated controversy and waves of comments will always be quicker than outweighed balanced opinions. And so I think there are, at least two consequences, which we can really also see here in Germany. And I talked to many scientists. There are at least two consequences of this development, which are already visible. One is that on one hand, attempts to master such situations have led to a tendency to delete unpleasant and problematic statements, which of course is very, very, critical for a scientific discussion. And on the other hand, some researchers just refrain from engaging publicly out of fear of becoming a victim of all these heated discussions and shitstorms. So this is called silencing effect, of course, and this is a big worry. So I think we as funders have to take care that that those tendencies do not reduce our general capacity to openly share opinions and approach challenges such as pandemics or climate change in a fact-based way. And this is where I come back to what you just mentioned, Dominic. I really think we have to support and we have to safeguard our researchers here. We have to strengthen them. And so the DFG actually offers a budget for communication with each grant we allow. Yeah. Thanks.
Helen, how are you coping with the fact that you're getting information through all these new channels now? It's not just from the peer-reviewed journals, but it's science by press release, it's science by Twitter. You mentioned a few stories that you haven't picked up on. That's interesting. What are your criteria?
Oh, it depends on the day and what's under, what I mentioned earlier, that it's like being hit by a tsunami every day. And that's a bit of an exaggeration, but only slightly. I mean, it's so frequent and so exhausting that you'll be working on something and then something will come out. And, one of the things that journals have been doing frequently, in addition to the preprint thing, many journals now are not waiting until their normal embargo time, or the normal publication time. They're pushing. The science journals do this almost daily. They push out a press release saying this is available immediately. And on the one hand, you can't advocate for keeping science from the greater world if it's needed. On the other hand, when it's 3:00 and you're trying to finish a story and then this other paper comes along and you're trying to figure out, is this significant? Do I have to stop doing what I'm working on and start something afresh at this time? And the researchers are in Hong Kong, so they're going to be asleep. And, it's like, it's awful. It's just awful. And it's almost a daily occurrence. It's like juggling knives, and you don't always get it right.
Rick, if I can add to that, one of the things that is, Helen, adding to that, is that there's a perverse incentive on publishers, which is the more you publish, the more money you make with some of these APC business models. And we're fortunate because we're a scientific society. That's not our business model, but there is an incentive to publish as many of these 2,200, 2,300 papers that we get. There's a perverse incentive there, and we've, as a scientific society, we don't have to do that yet. But you have this situation where it's hard, especially for beyond the handful of journalists like you who actually know the difference between preprints and peer-reviewed articles. For them, what they're seeing on Twitter, what they're seeing on press releases, and then what they're seeing in preprints is not there's no context to it. Whereas, as a publisher, we believe very strongly in preprints because we believe that scientists, to be able to engage quickly and early, that's really important. But we weren't thinking about the fact that my mom would go look at preprints, or that a journalist without the context would go look. And so I think as we come to equilibrium again after this crisis, that we'll start to figure out how we provide that context for what is where is the information for which audience.
Right. Rick, if I can circle back to something you said in your introduction, you were talking about the fact that everybody's a science reporter now, and that other sort of streams of news aren't getting covered very much. What Sudeep just mentioned is like 100% true, and a really big part of the problem. There are professional science reporters, not enough of them, but some very, very good professional science reporters who have been covering the area for a long time and know how to read a study and know the difference between a preprint and a peer-reviewed study. But everybody is a COVID-19 reporter these days, and lots of people think they're COVID-19 experts. And, the pangolin study that I mentioned, the preprints that suggested the virus had been engineered in the Wuhan lab and deliberately released as a bioterror weapon or whatever. I mean, people or there was a paper that suggested that there was some facet of the virus that came from HIV. So that was a clear sign that it had been engineered. I mean, I didn't know what to make of that. How could somebody who used to be the education reporter at a newspaper in Minnesota, for instance, not to pick on education reporters in Minnesota, how would they know how to deal with that? All they would know is, oh my God, this seems like big news. And I don't know what the answer to this is, because I don't think we put this back in the box, but it has been extremely challenging and unfortunate, because it buffets the public in ways that aren't helpful.
Dominique?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that something we haven't talked about, that we are at a different stage of the issue attention cycle, or the issue itself, right? I mean, the pandemic, at least in the United States, started in March, and we are going through what we call, like a different stage of the media attention cycle. So all of us, we are like really involved in this issue, and Helen, obviously, this is really like part of your work and so on. But for the general audiences right now, like if you do, like you follow the news globally, COVID is actually going a little bit in the background. In the United States now is the elections, the fires in California, like the hurricane and so on. And so and it's interesting for us to remember that as that goes on, it's actually crucial for the press to actually maintain coverage of COVID-19, because this is where the public actually finds out about it. And I think as we see from the public audience's perspective, a fatigue about this pandemic, and I pointed out that for them right now the problem is how those kids are going to make it at school, etc., etc. We see less coverage of the issue, and I think this is something we should be worrying about. We need to maintain actually some attention that so people realize that this issue is not going away.
So this is related to another point I wanted to bring up with each of you. I think some of you noticed that in the recent Republican convention, coronavirus, COVID-19 was spoken of in the past tense. So politics are inevitably, even if this were not an election year in the United States, I'm sure politics would come into play here for various economic and other reasons. But they're really a major factor, as some of you have already mentioned. One thing I'm curious about, and I'll go to you first, Katya, on this. We're so absorbed, in the United States with everything that happens in the United States. So my impression is that although COVID-19 has been politicized in many parts of the world, maybe nowhere to the same extent that it seems to have been in the United States. Can you give some perspective from Europe and beyond about the role that politics is playing in the response to COVID-19?
Yeah, thanks a lot. So, well, from the German perspective, I must really say that that politics dealt quite well with the COVID-19 pandemic, because we somehow were lucky enough to find a way of communication between science and society and politics that made it possible for the whole society to accept the measures that had been taken, to ask the right questions. There have been some scientists very prominent in the media with daily podcasts, for example, and that was very well accepted. However, this will not continue forever, and we already see that even at the moment, although the topic of also science and society is very much in the focus in Europe, and there is increased awareness for better science communication as well, for many different reasons. But there are also tendencies of mistrust in science, which we increasingly and unfortunately see, although this is a small percentage of the population. And as I think Dominic has put it before, due to the complexity of scientific research, it is not always easy to explain why preliminary findings are subject to change and that new results can change a conclusion or a recommendation. And this, again, is difficult, of course, for politicians because they have to make decisions. So I think it is very, very important that scientists give counseling and recommendations to politicians. And we are still happy enough here in Germany to have quite a good situation in this respect. And I hope it will maintain. Yeah.
It does seem like the fact that science naturally evolves and that the answers change over time is a big problem for a lot of people who, maybe in life generally, but maybe in particular around issues of science, expect answers. And when those answers change or get communicated differently over time, trust can start to break down. And then we have a serious problem on our hands. I'm wondering, Sudha, and then I'll come around to you, Helen. You are in Washington, D.C., which we all know is sort of the belly of the beast of all things political in the world. I wonder if you could talk about the challenges you faced as an institution that's trying to stay above the fray. You're a nonprofit, you're nonpartisan, but you're surrounded by a political milieu. How do you do it?
Yeah. Carefully, very carefully. The key thing, and I say this often, is that the time to develop relationships between scientists and policymakers is not during the urgency of a crisis, but before the crisis. You have to have a relationship that is built on shared values. And one really interesting piece of information from some of the surveys is that before COVID, science had a very good, strong reputation in the United States. Large majorities of people are strongly supportive of science. But if you ask them to name a scientist, they couldn't, right? They couldn't. Now, Tony Fauci is probably the most famous scientist in America, most certainly. And that's a change. But we need that relationship earlier. And so at AAAS, what we do is we constantly are building relationships with policymakers. We place 30 fellows in offices on Capitol Hill every year so that they can both be a part of learning how the legislative process works, but also how the policymakers can make use of their science background. We place people into the executive branch of the U.S. government as well. But these measures are too small. They're too small. We have to do this at scale. We have 50 states. We have local municipalities where a lot of these decisions are being made, and we need to be able to connect scientists with the policymakers earlier.
Helen, and then Dominique. Oh, you're on mute, Helen.
Sorry, I was just going to circle back to the comment that you had made about people holding it against scientists effectively when science evolved. I mean, as the U.S. administration has become increasingly annoyed with Tony Fauci because the pandemic isn't going away and he doesn't talk about it in the past tense as they would like him to, he has been accused as being wrong on so many things. The people in the administration who advocate sort of unfettered opening up because they're more concerned about the economy and the economic downturns effect on the president's reelection chances. I mean, they talk frequently about how wrong Tony Fauci has been, and in fact, it's it's a convenient way of ignoring the fact that science evolves, and we need to be able to evolve with it.
Dominique?
Yeah, I wanted to build up on something that Sudeep said, and actually Kasia mentioned this, that we need to remember that actually trust in science as an institution in the United States is actually very high. The only other institution that actually is higher is the military. And then all the others that have been consistently followed by the National Science Foundation every 2 years, there's actually a good like study that follows all those issues of trust. So we need to say that this is the case. People in general will rely in science for making decisions, maybe not the science that we think is the good science, but for their own point of view, they're going to say, based on this study, we shouldn't get vaccines. They think there is a study. So somewhere they believe in science. However, they do not understand the process of science. I would go back that then the issue is much bigger, and it's a problem of literally education. Is that how do we teach kids and so on how science is produced and challenged and come to play, and how it's developing in society and so on. What's a recent study that we did, we asked people if they knew what a peer-reviewed journal was. People do not know what it is. We asked them if they knew what a retraction was in science. People do not know what it is. So we actually take for granted that people have the same understanding of the scientific process that we do, but the fact that they don't is just a factual reality that we need to address systematically at the country level. And I say, this is something Kaja can mention, because Germany is a little different in that respect. But I think the lack of understanding of the scientific process is really something we should address at the K-12 education level.
Mm. Yeah, it almost seems on the journalism side, there should just be a boilerplate 2 or 3 sentences that should be at the end or maybe at the beginning of every single story that's about something scientific. Hey, as you read this, keep in mind, this is going to change. This is not the answer. What science lives and dies for is to try to disprove what it proved today. This is what scientists love to do, and what we pay them to do. So please don't be surprised, when it gets different, because different is better, not worse. But anyway, I don't think we're going to see that on every news story in my lifetime. Katja, did you have your hand up a little bit there?
Yes, thanks. Just maybe 2 very small additional aspects. One concerning the EU and the engagement of the EU, and the second one concerning also public trust in what scientists can recommend. So, as a coordinated action at the EU member state level, the EU Commission Services and National Authority developed the ERA versus Corona Action Plan. I think that just should be mentioned here. And this plan covers 10 short-term actions, including a European clinical trial network, which I think is very good, and also a rich database on funding and also research infrastructure. So this is quite nice to see that there really is a close coordination also on European level. And now concerning the trust in science, I hope that we will not see the following scenario. And now I'm speaking also as an infection biologist, since I did malaria research for many years. With all these clinical trials out there, starting with vaccine candidates, some of them having not been really fully developed yet. So vaccination already starts in some population. I really hope that we won't see side effects. This is, I think, something we have to watch very, very critically, because the vaccination compliance then, of course, might be drastically reduced in many countries. And here I think that the media have a very, very important responsibility in kind of trying to somehow counteract this. Yeah.
That's a great point, and a very scary scenario that some reporting that emphasizes, adverse events, a term that most people don't really understand, but it might just be whatever, redness and swelling at the injection site. If that's going to be enough to reduce compliance and people using vaccines that are otherwise effective, it's a heavy responsibility on you, Helen. So it's all on you. How are you gonna deal with that? I'm exaggerating, of course, but
yeah, no, it's a huge issue. I mean, I've actually written a story about the fact that a lot of the vaccines so far, the evidence that's emerging is that a lot of them are quite reactogenic, meaning that they induce, they have a kick. It's not like they are making people severely ill or sending people to hospital, but they, people don't necessarily feel well after they've gotten several of these vaccines. The point in writing it was to effectively inoculate people against the news. If you tell them now this is going to be one of those vaccines that you might feel crappy after you get it, then if they don't, they feel lucky. If they do, they feel like, okay, I knew that was going to happen. If that was the purpose for writing the piece. In terms of Katja's point, though, about sort of rarer side effects and potential problems that relate to the vaccine, I mean, the reality of vaccine development is that, even if you test in 30,000 people, you're never going to see an event that might happen at a 1 in a million rate until you give it to multiple millions of people. And that's just the way it is with vaccine development. And then teasing out, especially in a scenario where multiple new vaccines are likely to be deployed at the same time, and people will probably have no idea if they got vaccine X or vaccine Y, and may not have great records, especially if things are given at sort of large clinics as opposed to their own physician. You could have a terrible situation where a signal of something emerges. People are trying to figure out which vaccine it might be affiliated with, or whether it's affiliated with all the vaccines. Is it significant enough to halt use of that vaccine? I mean, in my experience covering vaccine development, and I've done a lot of work on it, actually, people take this really seriously. And even people, scientists who desperately want a vaccine to work will, step forward instantly and say, hey, we got to stop for a minute. We have to hit the pause button because we see something we need to explore. That happened with the Merck Ebola vaccine, the only Ebola vaccine that has ever been licensed anyway, the first vaccine that was licensed, a trial in Switzerland showed some sort of rheumatic side effects in some people who got it, and they paused that trial. We're probably going to need to tell people that this could happen and explain to them what it means, and in the way that I tried to inoculate people about reactogenicity, because this could happen. And if people don't understand that pausing a trial is the morally and ethically correct thing to do, they may really misinterpret what is happening. We have very choppy waters ahead in terms of vaccine deployment, and vaccine deployment in an era of high vaccine hesitancy.
Right. And of course, we're talking about something given to a healthy population, so safety matters a lot. And there are a lot of people, at least in the United States, and I suspect elsewhere, who feel like I can just do this. I can stay healthy. I've stayed healthy this long. The sort of cowboy American mentality runs strong here. So we'll see. One almost last topic I want to touch on as we start to get towards wrapping up, and that has to do with cooperation and competition. In each of the fields that you are in, they are competitive in various ways. Journalists, we know, are always striving to be the first to get a story and get the scoop. Funders, there are many funding agencies that, to some extent cooperate, I'm sure, but also are competing. SUDIP, you're in, a day-to-day battle with, Nature and other journals around the world who are vying for the best papers. Has anything about this pandemic lowered those boundaries and encouraged degrees of cooperation that maybe didn't exist before? And is that sustainable? This is partly a question from the audience, Katja, so I'm going to start with you because someone is asking about that with regard to funders. But I'm interested in at least briefly touching on each of you to see if that is one positive outcome that may be coming out of this.
Yeah. Thank you also for this question from the audience. Well, from my point of view, we see both. We see wonderful cooperations, great national and international global collaborations, many funding agencies bringing out, calls for joint actions, and joint databases are being started, and multinational funding is facilitated, and also on an individual basis. Many scientists start to connect to others they maybe haven't collaborated with before. And the DFG is certainly trying to encourage all researchers to engage with the topic of pandemics, whether in direct connection with the topic or on a collaborative or even multidisciplinary or transdisciplinary basis. At the same time, as I mentioned briefly before, unfortunately, we also see an increasing level maybe of competition. And this is somehow, strengthened maybe also by the competition between different countries, different states, by political influence. And I think as a scientific community, we really have to be strong and strengthen and foster collaboration.
Science does have that reputation of being able to bridge political differences. I think there's a real crucible test that we're heading into here. Sudip, what about on the publication side? Just in the last few minutes here, anything you can say about that?
Absolutely. Just on the collaboration side, we work with so many societies, so many individual discipline societies, and the level of collaboration amongst them to one, hold the feet to the fire of our scientist colleagues who are in these roles in government, to keep them to try and keep them building levels of trust with scientists has been really wonderful to see. Also, in terms of working with our politicians to try and hold their feet to the fire as well. When it comes to publications and publishing, some of the first acts of cooperation were our editors-in-chief getting together and saying, what can we make available as quickly as possible? Are there any best practices here? And you see that in terms of all COVID papers, particularly with even some of the commercial publishers. We have wonderful colleagues at Nature. Springer Nature is a much larger commercial publisher. We're a society publisher, but we find ways to collaborate because, frankly, it's a very small world. Our people all know each other, and this is there's more than enough papers and more than enough science to publish. The criticality is getting it right and making sure that we do a good job of curating and disseminating.
That's inspiring to hear. Helen, journalists traditionally extremely competitive. Do you find that some of your colleagues and other outlets are talking to each other, sharing tips, being collegial?
Journalists are competitive, but I find science journalists are actually very collegial. I have a lot of friends who work for other publications. Sudeep employs several of them. I'm very, very good friends with Martin Enserink and Kai Kupperschmidt and John Cohen, who write some of the best material on infectious diseases and COVID-19 that you're going to find. We're in regular contact, and I curse at them, and many mornings when I discover that they've written a story that I wanted to write, or something I was already working on, and damn. But in the main, I think it's very, I don't know, my experience is fairly collaborative. I mean, I'm a big fan of Ed Yong at The Atlantic. There are a number of really good people in science journalism. And I mean, you probably know this, and know Dominique would know this. In journalism, it's common to, or at least it used to be, to sort of move around. You might be like a business reporter for a while, then you become a political reporter, or you might become a foreign correspondent. I mean, and I did all of that kind of stuff earlier in my career. But when people get to the science beat, they typically stay for a really long time. And so you get to know people, and I don't know. There's a very active science journalism community on Twitter. And I think people are supportive of each other's work, because it's not like, I don't mean to suggest there's, this is all kumbaya or something. I mean, there are times when people don't agree with the take somebody's taken in a story, but I don't find it cutthroat. I really like my site's journalism friends.
Yeah, I took things to the other extreme. I'll just throw in a personal note. I was getting ready at Science News Magazine years ago to write the story that I thought was going to be fantastic about parasitism and some of the quirks there, and then woke up one morning to see a story with all of my best anecdotes there in the New York Times. And my revenge on that reporter was ultimately I married her. But anyway, Dominique, is there anything on this angle that applies to your field? I'm not sure.
Yeah, actually, I could mention the initiative from the National Academy of Science right now. I'm part of Sean, which is a social network of social scientists that actually do rapid expert consultation based on questions from policymakers at the local level and the national level. And that committee that I'm part of is collaborated with the Standing Committee on Infectious Disease. So we have a strong collaboration with actually infectious disease research and public health researchers. And I don't think that was the case before. And I think COVID-19 really, we're testing this to see how well it works, but it's actually really an example of collaboration put together at the national level by the most visible scientists, a wide range of discipline to answer present questions. And I think this is a great development.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up. For anyone in the audience who hasn't paid attention to this Sean site, SEAN, co-hosted by the National Academies in the United States. Fantastic information, big focus on social and behavioral sciences, and every, updates coming out regularly that are just excellent and important for journalists to see, and accessible, written in a way that the public can understand it as well. So big kudos to the scientific community and group of communities that have come together in that way. That was a very smart move. We're down just to the last 2 minutes here. So I will just ask very quickly if anyone has a half a minute they want to add to the end before we sign off. Sudip, I'll just go quickly around the horn here. Quick comment?
Just a privilege to be in the same space with all of you. We have our work cut out for us over the next 6 to 8 months.
Great. Glad you're on the case. Katja?
Yeah, it was a great discussion. Thanks a lot for this. And let's take this current Corona crisis as a challenge, but also as a chance for better cooperation, better communication, deeper understanding, and better preparedness for our joint future on this planet. Thank you.
Thanks. Dominique?
Well, just to reiterate something I said before, pleasure to be with all of you. But let's remember that science doesn't stand alone. Scientific facts are not disconnected from the reality and need to be actually put into the social context that means something to the shared values of the people we're trying to talk to.
Great. And Helen?
Again, as the others have said, this has been a really interesting discussion, and I was really thrilled to be part of it. I'm regularly pitched these days with from people who want to talk about preventing the next pandemic, and I'm like, hold on, let's get this one over with, before we go there. Enough to deal with right now. But what I would say is that I hope when this calms down, that there is enough energy left in the community of people who are involved in this kind of stuff to actually do a really good, after action work, so we learn the lessons. Sometimes everybody's so exhausted, or the next crisis comes up and things don't get done. And there's a lot we need to learn from how this went.
Great idea. And it's this kind of group of people hitting this topic from the different perspectives and the mosaic approach that we've taken today that will help, I think, make sense out of all this in the end. So I hope to see you all and others again when this is over to talk it through and learn from it. I want to thank all 4 of you for being with us today. This has been a super stimulating discussion. Thanks to everyone in the audience, and we'll see you around at the next Zoom get together for a while to come, I guess. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.